Chapter 5: The Reunion and the Idea. It was in the early days of the Cooperatists of America that John Chandler met Lisa Cromwell. He recalls, quote, "I was at this fundraiser party, and this girl comes up to me afterwards and starts firing all of these questions at me about cooperatism, looking for answers. She wanted to know how this would work and how that would work and how would I handle the problem of this and that and the other. These were questions I really didn't have any definitive answers for at the time, and then when I hesitated to reply, she fires off all these answers. Needless to say, I was impressed, speechless, in awe, and I guess in love." End quote. They were soon married and started a family. They had 2 girls and a boy. Lisa recalls, quote, "We didn't have a lot of money. As the kids grew into their teens, money became important to them, or rather the lack of money became a hindrance to them. They were a bit annoyed that John and I didn't make more money like some of the other parents. They understood our commitment to the idea of cooperatism. We, of course, explained it all to them as they got old enough to understand it. We told them that, just like them, we didn't think that the enjoyment of life should be so dependent on money, and that is what we were trying to change. They wished we could work on changing the world and have a lot of money at the same time. Also, they were not particularly proud of the quirky reputation we had among the other parents. They took quite a bit of flack from the other kids, and obviously this did nothing to improve their social lives. They didn't reject cooperatism in the movement, but they did try to distance themselves from it, at least with their peers. Eventually, they learned about Strickland's economic class, and simultaneously learned that Jordan LaMarche was in it as well. Now, Jordan LaMarche had gone on to be sort of a household name, known to most of the U.S. population as one of the wealthy elite. And you could always find his name somewhere in print, in the financial and business sections of the newspapers or investment and business journals. He had made it to the upper echelon of the financial world. So the kids wanted to know why John didn't become buddies with him. We'd be set for life now, they'd say. They kept trying to encourage John to call up Jordan and go work for him so he could be rich. Jordan became sort of an icon for them. They'd say things like, "Can you imagine how cool it must be to be one of his kids?" I know this cut John to the quick deep inside, but on the outside he brushed it off easily. However, I'm sure it made him question more than once the life he'd chosen. Obviously, it was a bit disappointing for John and myself that our children had no desire to come on board with us, but their lives were their own, and they had to live them however they chose. We helped them to get ahead in whatever ways we could, and they ended up with respectable jobs. They started families and became fully aware of how money controlled the world, everyone's world. How we all grow up, live, and die with money concerns, unless you happen to be a Jordan LaMarche. End quote. After college, Jordan set off on a course to seek his fortune. He was extremely successful in many different business ventures, amassing a great deal of personal wealth. Early on, he married Mary Washburn and had a family, 2 boys and a girl. They were never without a great deal of financial means because Jordan, by way of his important and weighty family connections, was offered tremendous opportunities and advantages from the outset. His influential father put in a good word here and there and pulled some corporate strings to help his son bypass all of the normal pit stops and plateaus a young man would usually have to negotiate as he worked his way up the ladders of success. Jordan took full advantage of this and rose to financial prominence quickly, but it was not without a cost. He didn't have much of a family life. He was always in meetings, taking phone calls, traveling here and there. His life was his financial success, and he didn't mind this. In fact, he enjoyed it. It was all exhilarating and exciting to him. But the same was not always true for his family. Of course, they took extravagant vacations and never wanted for anything. However, as Jordan tells us, quote, I didn't have a very strong connection with my children as they were growing up, end quote. He explains further in his memoirs, quote, naturally, they loved me. I was their dad, but I didn't have much in common with them. I only got the synopsis of what was happening in their lives. I was never really involved. I tried to be enthused about what they were doing, and I was. I'd go out of my way to over-exaggerate this during the sporadic periods I did have with them or when I talked with them on the phone. But it wasn't enough to forge any sort of real connection. It was all superficial. I missed so many of Stephen's soccer games and Dave's performances and all the events in Natalie's life, all of those father-son, father-daughter things. I kept justifying it by telling myself that all of my business efforts were for their benefit. It was securing their futures. But as it turns out, my wealth had very little influence on securing what they envisioned their futures to be. Steve had dreams of being a professional soccer player, Dave was set on the performing arts, and Natalie wanted to be a French teacher. None of them had the least interest in following in my footsteps or inheriting the corporate dynasty I'd set up. It came as a shock to me, a gradual one, but nevertheless a shock all the same. I kept denying it because I couldn't imagine how anyone would not want what I wanted. I kept thinking that eventually they would set these other things aside, having got them out of their systems, and come to realize the huge advantage and excitement of choosing to come on board with me. Then, I told myself, that's when the real bonding would take place. That's when I would have my real relationship with them. That's when they will be so proud of me and what I've done in my life. And that's when I will be so proud of them and how they will carry on the legacy. It never occurred to me that this wouldn't be so. Wealth didn't mean much to them. Oh, sure, they were glad they had it. They had all the advantages. They were able to do whatever they wanted growing up. Money was no object. They had a respect for it because we tried to teach them that. And I think we did. But money wasn't the all-important thing that it was for me. They had their dreams, soccer, performing arts, and French. And if they could do those things and make a decent living, then that's all they cared about. Of course, they knew that they had my wealth to fall back on, so no matter what they did in life or how little money they made, they would not want for anything. But they really didn't rely on that either. They didn't want to depend on Dad's money. Kind of a pride thing, I guess. They wanted to live their own lives, and I suppose there was a bit of conscious and unconscious resentment there to some degree, a sort of, no, you can't just buy your way back into our lives, Dad. It was never really spoken, but I sensed it in between the lines. It was Natalie who first became interested in cooperatism. In college, she spent several semesters abroad in France, where she met her future husband. He was a member of the League and a very enthusiastic supporter of cooperatism. Needless to say, this was not someone I hoped would remain in her life for very long. I liked Jacques. He was a very personable, passionate young man, but obviously we didn't see eye to eye on many things. My involvement in that economics class in my college days was never really discussed while my children were growing up. Not because I was intentionally avoiding it, but because it didn't mean much to me. It didn't make much difference in my life. I had more important things to get on with. The notoriety was entertaining for a while it lasted, but it faded, and I moved on, gaining far more notoriety through my wealth. That was the notoriety that I wanted. That is what meant something to me. So I'd pretty much left the economics class behind. Every once in a while, someone would make the connection, and I'd be reminded. I'd say something like, huh? Oh, yeah, whatever, unimportant. If it came up in an interview, I'd acknowledge it and then quickly dismiss it, moving on to other subjects. My wife obviously knew about it, but like I said, as I moved into other exciting ventures, it became inconsequential. It just didn't matter to me or us. But Jacques brought it up. He asked if I was the Jordan LaMarche of that famous economics class. And I flippantly replied, yeah. And then I became an instant celebrity in his eyes. He wanted to hear everything I could possibly remember about that class, and if I still knew John Chandler, Milt Connolly, and Patty Stinson. Sadly, in his eyes, I hadn't kept up any sort of relationship with them over the years, but he lost no admiration for me with this admission. So that's how the kids came to know of that economics class and their father's role in it. Through Jacques, they all discovered and began to develop an interest in cooperatism. Sometimes the irony in life is so profound. While growing up, my children had plenty of opportunity to hang out with other rich kids, but their interests and their passions led them to mingle more with those far below their social class. They just seemed to befriend and have more of an affinity with many of their peers who had far less financial means than they did. And through these relationships, they came to realize the huge imbalances that existed between those that had means and those that did not. Later in life, they actually confessed that they felt guilty to a degree, having such ample opportunity in life through no particular fault or talent of their own. They realized that they were no more gifted or intelligent than many of their less financially endowed peers, and in many cases, far less talented and or intelligent. And yet, just because they had me as their father, they were afforded far more opportunity and advantage. This was pointed out to them again and again by their own experience in life. It was obvious how imbalanced the system was, and they saw the godlike role money plays in people's lives. They saw there was always a price to pay for financial success. For some, lost time with their family or other hardships endured to win that success. Often the price is paid by the loser of a financial skirmish, such as a small business being driven out of business by a corporate conglomerate. Either way, they realized that the financial success has a price for someone. So they were never particularly proud of being labeled the rich kids. They just wanted to fit in and not be judged in terms of my wealth. They were very aware that many of their friendships came about simply because others knew they had money and wanted to be on their good side, not necessarily because there was any real friendship there, but because of their wealth. And if they failed to come up with the goods, so to speak, these friends lost interest. For the most part, they weren't on the same path as most of their other wealthy peers who were being groomed mentally and financially to inherit their place in the privileged class of society. So they were continually trying to hide the fact that they were rich. They wanted to be judged on their own merit. They were very sensitive to this and often wondered why this whole money system had to create such rifts between people. This is why, when they learned of cooperatism, that it had such a profound impact on them. This was the world they wished they had grown up in, not rich, not poor, just everyone on an equal footing, where no one was advantaged or disadvantaged, and where everyone was free and unrestricted to enjoy their passions in life without worrying how to afford them. They enthusiastically joined the league, and of course, pleaded and prodded and encouraged me to do the same. My role in Strickland's economic class became, for my kids, even though I was for the most part the opposition, my greatest claim to fame. It was the one thing they were truly most proud of me for. There's that irony again. So you can see the position I was in. For the first time, I actually had the admiration of my kids. I was not about to squander that opportunity. I had always held cooperatism as an idealistic, unrealistic, and impractical approach to the structuring of a modern society. But in that class, I did become aware of the obvious faults, injustices, and disadvantages of a money system. Of course, I didn't want to admit that because I would have to negate a great deal of what I was taught to believe in when I was growing up. I would have to reconsider to a degree my mission and my purpose in life. The money system was what was going to make my dreams come true. That was how I was going to make my dad and family proud of me. And it did all of those things. However, once I achieved my goals and was sitting in a position of power, it was easier for me to revisit and reconsider cooperatism. And my kids, simply because they were my kids, had the ability to open my mind to other considerations in life. And like I said, it's not like these considerations were not always there. I had simply suppressed them in favor of others that were more aligned with my goals. But now, my goals were my children. They begged me to call John Chandler and reconnect. Can you imagine how awkward that was? End quote. Now we switch to John Chandler's recollection of that reunion. Quote, one day I get a call out of the blue from Jordan LaMarche, the Jordan LaMarche. Milt, Patty, Scott, Lisa, and I would every so often read something about Jordan and comment about how amazingly successful he had become. And of course, if we missed it, my kids would always mention it. I remember how on more than one occasion it would be voiced by one of us how we wished he, Jordan, was on our side. A couple of times, especially early on when we were struggling for funds, the thought crossed my mind to give him a call, but I never did. There didn't seem to be any point to it. The guy was obviously committed to capitalism. What was I going to say? Hey, Jordan, how's it going? Any chance of you helping us out? You know, just for old time's sake. By the way, my kids think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And now, more than 30 years later, I get a call from Jordan LaMarche. He asks if we could get together sometime and discuss a few things. Stunned, I say, sure, picking my jaw up off the floor. So we set up a meeting, and he tells me what's been going on with him. And he tells me he wants to help support the league. Wow. And he wants his kids to be very involved as well as part of the deal. I was practically speechless. With a winning smile, and in a way that was sort of half joking, half not, he said, I still don't think it'll ever work, John, but my kids will think I'm a total hero for this. And with them committed to this cause, then what am I going to do with all this wealth? I would still much prefer if they would come in on my family business, but it looks like that isn't going to happen. They're too idealistic, he said, staring straight at me. Then he broke into a broad smile and added, it must be their mother's side. I laughed. Then he continued, and I've got nothing to worry about. I've got everything I want for the rest of my life because this whole cooperatism thing sure as hell isn't going to happen in our lifetime, if it happens at all, and it won't. But if it does, if it happens in our kids' or our grandkids' or our great-grandkids' lifetime, then they'll be happy, right? Promise me that. He grinned again. Promise me this is going to be one hell of a utopia, John. I smiled. There was a pause. Then he continued. Well, it looks like you've come a long way from that economics class. I quickly added, so have you. Then thoughtfully he added, yeah, I was thinking just the other day how strange, ironic, and unpredictable life can be. He shook his head. Who would have thought? There was a moment for him there. There was a moment for both of us there. Then he bounced back into it. Well, I'm thinking you can use all the help you can get, right? It just so happens we were deep into the planning stages of Henderson's Alpha City idea. I told him about the idea and introduced him to Henderson and the rest of the people intricately involved in the financing of the project. Like the rest of the financial heavyweights on board, Jordan kept his participation in the league invisible to the rest of the world. He didn't want it to interfere with any edge he had in corporate circles, and neither did we. Jordan was a huge asset. He had endless connections and a great mind for business. He was very well respected among our wealthy members and was sort of the go-to guy when we ran into a major problem. He had so many contacts and ways to get things done that were not through normal channels. The League, hidden behind Gragon, became a huge powerhouse in the world of international big business. And when Gragon decided to pursue the Alpha City Resort project, doors opened right and left because of Gragon's reputation and Jordan's connections. That meeting with Jordan took place just before Thanksgiving holiday. So although I was bursting to tell the kids about the news, I waited until we all sat down to dinner and then said, "By the way, you'll never guess who came on board with Gragon and the League the other day." Well, that changed things for them, and obviously me, and just as obviously for my relationship with my kids. Now, having a taste of the money system and experiencing their own frustrations with it, coupled with learning that one of their heroes, the great Jordan LaMarche, has become a supporter of the League and the cooperatist movement, even if in sort of an indirect sort of way, one by one they came on board and started working with us. They got along great with Jordan's kids, and soon were all very involved, working together, doing what they could to further the cause. End quote.